You're so obedient. Gosh, lower the lights and you all quiet down. Welcome back. So I have an hour with you. There's a number of pieces I hope I can put together. Pray I can do it in a way that's helpful and to the point. So we want to keep walking around this mystery of cleaning up, growing up, waking up, which allows us to clarify the separate self and the shadow self. I'm going to begin with one of the back wheels of our tricycle, Scripture. And this is from Luke 18. And it's another example, if Jesus indeed told this parable, how tremendously insightful he was about the nature of true religion and the dangers of false religion. You've all heard it. It's the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. So he loves to make a point by creating a dualistic distinction and then reconciling it at a higher level, which is a wisdom teaching. So this is in Luke 18, verse 9. Jesus told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous, and they treated others with contempt. So already in the first sentence, you have a severe judgment of the capacity of religion to aggrandize itself and to project its shadow, to use our Jungian language, project it elsewhere. And the danger of thinking of yourself as overly anything in terms of pure or holy or wonderful, because usually if that's the case, you have taken your own shadow material and projected it onto another group, another race, another religion, and it's quite effective. You don't see it. You really think it's Islamic people who are violent. And you'll find all the necessary evidence, of course. You can always find, the ego will always find the evidence it needs to justify the point it wants to make. Back to the parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee. Now, mind you, in those of you who've grown up Christian, the word Pharisee naturally connotes something bad. It was the very fervent, good, law-abiding Jews. Think of the group in your home denomination who are the most fervent. That's what a Pharisee is. And the other, a tax collector. Now, this allows me to make several points. No, not the ones you think. But when you and I hear the word tax collector, we just think it's part of the deal of any institution. But when you're a colonized country, a tax collector is taking your money to support the imperial organization that's raiding your country. So the word tax collector in Jesus' lifetime is synonymous with bad person or sinner. In fact, the very notion of sin, and this goes close to what we're saying about separate self, it wasn't the individual, it was much more the class or category or occupation you had. There were good occupations, there were bad occupations. This was a bad one, tax collector. So he sets up the story. Good guy, bad guy. Now the Pharisee, the supposed good guy, standing by himself, notice his individualism and solipsism. He prayed in this way: God, I thank you that I am not like other people, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, and even like this poor tax collector over here. I fast twice a week, and he probably did. I give tithes of all that I collect, and he probably did. Jesus doesn't question that. But the tax collector, standing far off, I guess implying a sense of unworthiness perhaps, or humility, not even lifting up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, here these are called reverse parables, or the great turnaround. And Jesus loves to do this. I tell you, this man went home justified. You realize that doesn't make any sense. He's the sinner. The only thing he did was admit that he was a sinner. And the other, in fact, did not. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled. We're familiar with that final line. But the one who humbles himself will be exalted. So this is probably one of the clearest examples, although the prodigal son story makes the same point, to show something that is rather shocking until you're told it. Jesus is not upset at sinners. He really isn't. Shocking. He would not be a good clergyman at all, you know. They made us into what some call sin managers. You know, our job was to organize and forgive and make sure sin was properly named and so forth. But you can go through the Gospels, and it's shocking once you check it out. Jesus is not upset at sinners. He is only upset at people who don't think they are sinners. Check it out. Now, our inability to see that, I think, reveals much of the problem with what we call the shadow. You can't see what you don't want to see. And unless you have falling experiences, necessary humiliations, what I call in the Falling Upward book, necessary suffering, or a good mirror like a good partner or friend, you normally will not see your shadow. So, you know, this was surprising to me, but when Angel and I were talking, she readily said the same thing from her tradition. Waking up exercises, which we all keep promoting to you as contemplation or meditation or some practice, do not of themselves help with cleaning up or growing up. And here's why that's true. Because you have your waking up experience at your level of growth. So you have to keep growing to have a truly unitive experience after you've done an awful lot of your shadow work. And here's the danger, even in us teaching all of you contemplation. And we've both seen it happen, Angel and I at least, I'm sure Mirabai has too. A lot of people, because now contemplation is in and trendy and the new way to be superior and saved, there's a lot of people buying into contemplation, thinking that means they've woken up or that they will wake up. But let me repeat, waking up exercises like meditation do not of themselves help with cleaning up or growing up. You've still got to do both. You've still got to keep dealing with the ever more clever disguises of your shadow self. Now here I'm going to sense Ken Wilber is amounting to the fourth teacher here this weekend. I'm going to quote, I think I've quoted this at least twice in this room over the last 20 years, from Ken Wilber's 1997 diary called One Taste. And his entry on February 11th says this. I'm going to read it at some length because it's so helpful and so clear. He says, religion has always performed two very important but very different functions. First, it acts as a way of creating meaning for the separate self. I would say that was almost entirely the early form of religion I was given. How can I, little Dickie, find a way to feel holy and Catholic and loved by God? It offers myths and stories and tales and narratives and rituals and revivals that, taken together, help the separate self to make meaning and sense of and endure the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. This function of religion does not usually or necessarily change the level of consciousness in a person. It just reinforces the level that you're already at, that you're good, you're right, and you have to do that to grow up. That's what I call the task of the first half of life, which is about growing up. This does not deliver radical transformation, nor does it deliver a shattering liberation from the separate self. It consoles the self, and you need that. I don't think you can get to 35 with any kind of health without some good consolations, validations, legitimations, a good job, a good family. You got to do something right to feel good about yourself. And God doesn't begrudge you that. But that's not transformation. That's creating your form, not changing your form. Transform means to change the form to something different. We don't have to change the substance. Remember what we said yesterday. The substance is already in place. You're already objectively, ontologically children of God. Well, we don't need to tamper with that at all. But we need to keep you growing up so you have greater and greater capacity to receive such a momentous proclamation. So the tasks of the first half of life: console the self, fortify the self, defend the self, promote the self. As long as this separate self believes the myths, performs the rituals, mouths the prayers, embraces the dogma, then that self, it is fervently believed, is saved. Either now, in the glory of being God-saved or Goddess-favored, or in the afterlife that ensures eternal wonderment. So, here's the rub in the whole thing. The better you do the first half of life, you give yourself, like I did. I left Kansas, went off and got myself a very positive self-image, From my German farm family, the son, the priest, was just, well, I couldn't go any higher. This is before Vatican II. That isn't true anymore, but in my days it was, I was white, I was educated, just the world was created for me. So almost because I succeeded so well, people like me have to fall farther, all right? The higher you go, the farther you got to fall. So don't be too happy if you've been successful your first 35 years, all right? This is what we mean and what the whole scriptural tradition means by God favors the one at the bottom instead of the one at the top. Because the one at the bottom doesn't have so far to fall. They're not so filled with illusions like the rest of us are. You see, we call that now in Catholic liberation theology the preferential option for the poor. That there is a bias in the bottom, toward the bottom, starting with God's choice of the enslaved people in Egypt, which is why they were the chosen people, because they were the people on the bottom. You always have a head start in the spiritual journey if you're in touch with your woundedness. I was so glad, Angel, when you talked about liberation this morning. If you try to create a spiritual journey that doesn't talk about woundedness, the word innocence means not wounded in Latin. There's nothing more dangerous than false innocence, thinking you're purer and more perfect than you really are. Back to Ken Wilber. But he says religion has also served in a usually, this is his quote, in a usually very, very small minority of the population, a second function. And he calls this the function of radical transformation and liberation. This function of religion does not fortify the separate self, but utterly shatters it. Not consolation, but devastation. This is John of the Cross's Dark Night of the Soul. This is Teresa's seventh mansion, if you will. You have to let go of this sense of yourself as being separate, the word we've used since the beginning of this conference. Now, remember I said we're 5 centuries into intense individualization, basically showing we're a first half of life culture. We just keep idealizing your separateness and your superiority. Now, another word for that part of you is ego. Your ego wants to be separate and wants to be superior. And many people think that's the whole function of life. They're still doing it at my age, trying to differentiate themselves from the hoi polloi, the unwashed masses, those other people who are not like me, just like we read from the Pharisee. In short, not a conventional bolstering of consciousness, but a radical transmutation and transformation at the deepest seat of consciousness itself. Now, in many ways, like Paul on the Damascus Road, it really only needs to happen once, although you need to stay with it and learn from it. But once in your life, the veil has to part. And you have to recognize that me thinking of myself as separate from you, as separate from God, as separate from your dog. As you know, this is the first conference in years I didn't have my dog sitting here with me. I had to put her asleep in March. But there has to be something in your life that you bond with that deeply or that profoundly that lets you know it's not all about you, but it's about us. The boundaries of self have to widen. Now, the phrase from Jesus that I find most helpful there is John 12:24. Unless the single grain of wheat die, it remains just a single grain. But if it dies, and of course this is the very biology of growth and all seed growth, it does have to lose its shell and mix with the earth around it to produce a new plant. So once we understand the spiritual meanings, it's amazing, and I mean this sincerely, how they're mirrored in the biological universe, the physical universe. The lessons are everywhere. In my new book that I'm trying to write on the universal Christ, it's so exciting to recognize how so much that I'm trying to say, or others are trying to say better than I, about the universal nature of this message, we're finding the best metaphors for what we're trying to say in the nature of the universe, the nature of the physical universe, because if truth is one, truth is one. The way things work is the way things work. And no new form ever happens in all of nature unless the old form dies. That's called death and resurrection. We call it the Paschal mystery. Now, we're the species that most resists that. And I can see why. It just doesn't make sense. Why should one form have to pass for another to emerge? We call that pattern evolution in another level of language. But the human species was given the freedom to hate it, to fight it, to resist it. In the Catholic funeral liturgy, at the preface before the Eucharistic prayer, we say, life is not ended, it is merely changed. Everybody should drop to the floor if they really heard that. Because most Catholics are terribly afraid of death because they were made to be afraid of God. So why wouldn't you be afraid of death? Your attitude toward death and God tend to be the same attitude. Why was it that my Father Francis could say, welcome, Sister Death? Because once you've passed the small death, as he called it, on this side of the physical final death, you're not afraid of it anymore, at least so much. I don't want to pretend that all of us aren't afraid of the unknown. But in other words, Jesus is not really concerned about you maintaining yourself at some level of purity or innocence, unwoundedness. The irony of ironies is that it's through the wounding that your illusions show themselves, your delusions show themselves. I think the reason so many of us appreciate Carl Jung so much is that probably more than anybody else, he gave us the language, not the concept. Jesus and the Buddha already talked about the concept. But the word shadow helped us recognize that it's a matter of recognition. And at one point toward the end of his life, he said, really, the shadow and the unconscious are the same thing. They're the same thing. And of course, he almost introduced the word unconscious. The power of the shadow is that it resides in the unconscious and prefers to stay there. See? Now that allows you, as I said earlier, to do evil, stupid, wrong things, and that's why a lot of us associate the shadow with badness. But again, to repeat, because you can't miss this point, it's not primarily about badness. It's about ignorance. It's about an inability to see certain things. And so that's why we speak of waking up, to see what up to now you have not been able to see. And you know, when it comes down to it, on so many levels, it's constantly seeing, and I certainly have to say this to myself every other day, I do not yet know how to love. It's just always new revelations in your inability to love, in your inability to let go of those self-protective, self-validating, self-confirming boundaries that we create around ourselves. And when you create them too strongly, when you're too defended, it seems like I almost always end up referring to the male rites of passage, but when I first started studying them in 1991, I tried to find out why there were not female initiation rites. And the consensus seemed to be that the female in general, there's obviously exceptions to everything, was a much less defended personality. She was much more relational. She would give up her ego boundaries for her children, for her husband. But the male, maybe you can blame it on centuries of warfare, I don't know. But the male psyche is much more boundaried, much more afraid of letting go of his identity. It creates patriarchy, what we call. And that's why in all known historic cultures, something like male rites of passage were created. To teach the male, usually between 13 and 17, it has to be much later now, because we're too immature at 13 and 17. But maybe by the 20s, to help the male let go of this over-defendedness. And it was always teaching him a journey into powerlessness in one sense or another. So Jesus was not upset at even what his own religion called sin, but he only got upset at people who were in denial, who were self-idealized, as we saw in the Pharisee. He only got upset at people who had a false self-image, who thought they were more than they really were. It is not, therefore, now this is the transition point. It's not that people who are imperfect, wounded, or fallen that are the problem. God doesn't seem to have any problem with that, you know. In fact, that tends to be the hole in the soul. Or as Leonard Cohen said, there's a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in. But you and I were taught to pretend there wasn't a crack, right? Because we would be hated for that. We would be, and in terms of human culture, that's largely true. So if hiding and denying was our first mistake, the second one was trying to make the individual self whole and holy. It just doesn't work. If you, as one little person, try to pretend you're psychologically whole and are not wounded, you're going to go into denial. It's inevitable because you're not. It's the body that is whole, and it's history that God is saving, not individuals. Once we individualize the gospel, the individual was incapable of carrying what Paul calls in one place the weight of glory, and another place the burden of sin. We couldn't carry the dark side, we couldn't carry the light side. The light side, by the way, was called by Jung the golden shadow. And let me spend a minute on that. And I bet this is really true, and in many ways our very theme exemplifies it. Not only do you hide your false self or your faults from yourself, but you actually are unwilling to believe what is best about you, what is good about you. Your golden shadow, that you are in fact objectively sons of God, is universal, or daughters of God, is denied by most of Western civilization. We can't carry the weight of such glory because we have so much evidence of how inferior we are. But if we could say, we, even this room of 1,000 people, we are the glory of God. I can carry that. Do you understand? But once I have to do it as a separate self, this is just my theory. Once you individualize the spiritual journey, you will go towards shadow denial. You will. Are projecting it elsewhere. Because you see so much contrary evidence inside of yourself. So first we have to recognize what we should have learned from the Hebrew Scriptures, that all of the great covenants of Yahweh with the people Israel were collective. They were not just with Abraham, they were not just with David, but with the house of David. Not just with Noah, but with all of creation. Read the covenant with Noah 3 times. And I will form this with all the creatures. Venus, did you hear that? All right. It's not just with human beings. Once you start making the divine love stingy, it gets stingier and stingier. I don't know if it's just that's not good English, I don't suppose. But, pretty soon when we decided God only loved human beings, well, then it was only certain human beings. And the group became more selective and more selective and more selective. Till now it's hardly good news. What the angels sing in the 2nd chapter of Luke at the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem is, this is good news for all the people, all the people. And maybe the Jews were a little upset at that, because they thought they were the chosen people. Of course, they were the chosen ones to tell us that we were chosen too. And in many ways, they've served that function very well. Some ways, not so well. And you do know that's the function of experiencing election, enlightenment, transformation, holiness, freedom, liberation. Now you are, this is going to sound like the 12th step of the recovery movement. Now you have the responsibility of passing on that good news. It's not to just keep saying, I'm saved, I'm better than you are, God loves me and not you. That is precisely to miss the point. In fact, at this point, my definition of a Christian, and you can transfer this to any other religion, I would hope, and I mean this sincerely. This is not, I promise you, this is not lightweight theology. All right? A Christian is one who can see Christ everywhere else, period. That's my definition. How far can you see Christ? Paul saw him in a bathtub, huh? Until you can see Christ everywhere else, you're not a Christian. Are there still some groups and religions and races and classes and homeless people that you're eliminating from being the image of God? Then you yourself are not Christ. Christ sees Christ everywhere else. That's the universal Christ. And that's what characterized our saints. They could always see the mystery in ever broadening circles. Now, I admit, that's the job of a whole lifetime. And each one is a test case, Okay. You pull back, you find yourself resisting a certain person or a certain group. At that moment, you've seen your shadow. One of the other good giveaways that you're dealing with shadow material is any temptation to want to blame or accuse. When the spotlight is on you and you immediately want to blame another person, she made me do it, he made me do it. That's almost always the quickest form of projection and shadow denial. You just had an opportunity to face, why is this upsetting me so much? Why am I so irritated? Why am I so churned up inside? Your shadow has just shown itself. And in that, if you're well trained, as most of us are, I am too, and when you feel that inner irritation, that inner churning, you immediately project it outward. It will take the form of blame someone else. The very word Satan, as we translated it, literally means the accuser. The accusing instinct is satanic. And with that, I want to move into a point that I didn't think I was going to make till today. But it's something that I teach in the Living School, so those of you in the Living School have heard this already. Forgive me, I hope I can say it better. But I want us not just to stop with what could perhaps be a psychological understanding, an individual understanding of the shadow. I want you to know where the shadow does its most damage is to recognize that we have collective shadows. We have national shadows. We have corporate shadows. And there's only one thing more dangerous than the individual inability to see, and that's when the whole group agrees together, we will not admit to this. We will never talk about this. You were leading us there this morning, Angel, beautifully so. And then it's almost impossible to see. Now, in the school, I teach it in this way. When I first studied moral theology in the mid-1960s, we looked at the traditional historic manuals of Catholic moral theology and built on them. But again, we were building on the tradition. And the old manual said something like this, that there were three sources of evil. And they were dangerous in this order. And if you didn't nip it in the bud at the first level, it would proceed to the second and to the third. And the three levels were called the world, the flesh, and the devil, in that order. I'm going to take a few minutes to try to describe all three levels. When Dom Helder Câmara, the holy archbishop from Brazil, heard this, he transmuted it into the three levels of violence. That, in fact, as evil better and better disguises itself, a culture or a corporation or an institution or a group becomes more and more violent, while not calling it violent. Remember in John 16, where Jesus says, when you kill me, you will think you are doing a holy duty for God. Our Blaise Pascal, the French philosopher, says, people never do evil quite so completely and quite so cheerfully as when they do it for a religious motive. Takes away all your guilt. All you got to do is think you're killing these heretics for God. And you don't suffer any guilt, any shame whatsoever. In fact, you're holier than thou because you're burning these damn heretics at the stake in the name of Jesus, who taught us nonviolence. You see, you turn values completely around. But stay with me a few minutes and let me try to describe the three levels. It's subtle, but I think you'll find it worth your while. So, what do we mean by the world? This is where it all snarls up. The world, first of all, it does not mean creation. It does not mean nature. The way the phrase the world is used, especially in John's gospel, you and I would translate the system. That would be the best possible word, the system. And more or less, you might have your own definitions, but what most of us mean by the system is the way groups, nations, states organize themselves for their own self-aggrandizement, for their own self-protection, for their own self-promotion. It's the very nature of institutionalization. It has to be. I mean, even the wonderful CAC. We have to have insurance, because people might sue us for this or that or whatever. It's the litigious nature of American society. You have to be concerned about raising money. We just had a wonderful lunch with some of our development people. Darn it. Why can't I be just like St. Francis and wait for it to fall from heaven? An institution in this world, now more than ever, although it was always this way, once you gather into a group, you have a whole bunch of agreed upon selfishness, for want of a better word, and necessary agreed upon selfishness. What you wouldn't be allowed to do by yourself, you're allowed to do for the group. So at this level, and these words, by the way, that I'm going to give you right now, didn't, at least in the Catholic world, become popularized till the 1980s. Institutionalized evil, social sin. Those words didn't exist. All sin was at the second level, which we're going to go to in a minute, the flesh. The individual faults of each of you in this room. We sort of jumped over the first level, the world, and put all of our moral effort and energy into the second level. But to go back to the world. Organizations, nation states, have to be self-aggrandizing, self-promoting, self-perpetuating, self-validating. We have to wave our flags and talk about how wonderful we are. You would never go to a 4th of July parade and hear a talk critical of America, would you? It's inconceivable. Huh? You have to self-congratulate and tell everybody how wonderful you are. And every other country does the same thing, and they have a right to it. But what I'm saying is, that's the collective shadow. That you can't, at a 4th of July parade, dare to say, well, were all of our wars really the land of the free and the home of the brave and just protecting the little guy? Probably not. But you don't dare say that. It's an agreed upon lie. Let me take it to the very specific moral level. None of you would think it's a moral thing to go out and kill somebody. I hope not. But if we do it for the collective, and it's called war, it's wonderful. None of you think it would be completely meritorious to be greedy and gluttonous, but in terms of the building the American economy and being bigger and bigger consumers, well, collectively it's good. What we created inside of at least the Christian world was a kind of schizophrenia, that what was individually bad was collectively admired. So just stay with that. It'll become clear. But that's the world, the system. The system manufactures itself for its own protection and will tell any degree of lie. But everybody inside of that system has to agree to not tell the lie. The reason my father Francis never accepted ordination, well, who am I to know his exact motivation? But we have a pretty good feeling, and you who are ordained in the room know what I'm going to say. Once you're an official spokesman or spokeswoman of an organization, you've got to speak the party line. You wouldn't be responsible. You wouldn't be rehired. You've got to. It's dangerous to represent anything corporately, because then you can't always tell the truth. This has ruined so many a clergyman. I have them come to me in confession and say, I don't believe half the stuff I teach, but I've got to keep my job. I don't even believe it anymore. I know it's not true. I know it's not the gospel. I know it's not what Jesus said, but the entire ministry association, if I come out in favor of gay equality, let's say, I'm going to lose my job and divide the church. So I got to say what I know is not the truth, but it'll make everybody happy. So truth whittles itself down at the world level. Now let's move to the second level. The cobra has begun to spiral at the bottom. It's all in place. We've agreed upon to tell lies. We've agreed upon that what was bad for the individual is good for the nation state or for the institution. That's what got the Catholic Church into this pedophilia problem, huh? You know, that when push came to shove, bishops would sooner protect the reputation of the Roman Catholic Church rather than the protection of children. Huh? There it is. It was almost like God made it to order. I'm not saying God planned this, but to bring us back to some proper humility and to recognize we did not love God, we loved the church. And we had made an idol of the church. It was made to order to reveal the shadow side of the Roman Catholic Church. But the same resistance that you and I have to individual shadow, people in positions of power will have to any revelation of their institutional immorality. So, for most of our history, we said this right at the beginning yesterday, we concentrated on cleaning up the flesh. All moral evil was pretty much confined to individuals. You're a bad person. You're a bad person. So we gave the fire and brimstone sermon to convince you how bad you were. It's called learned helplessness. Make the whole congregation feel sinful, and maybe they'll answer the altar call. It was just a terrible misplacement of attention. I'm not saying individuals aren't selfish, egocentric, and do wrong things. Of course they do. But when that's the only source of evil, the flesh, the individualized evil, you have a very poor perception of the real nature of evil. And now, as Thomas Aquinas says, evil must always disguise itself as good. And of course, Paul says the same thing in Corinthians. The angels of darkness disguise themselves as angels of light. That's what first attracted so many of us to the Enneagram, because that gave many of us as spiritual directors a tool to help every one of us see that the very thing which people admire in us is also our worst fault. I went through 13 years of education. I was only told after ordination that all 13 years they dropped little black and white beans at the end of the year in a velvet sack to vote whether you should go on to the next year. And one professor told me after I was ordained, you know what, Richard, you never got a black bean 13 years. You were this perfect, innocent, good little boy who always followed the rules, always on time, always respectful to your superiors. Good, 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 Now, that's what I was admired for. I was so dang good. Goody two-shoes, some of you would have called me. You would have hated me. Now, some of my classmates probably did. But that very thing, my supposed little stalwart Boy Scout personality, is my worst fault. It's the thing that makes me do the most terrible, stupid things. It's my worst fault and it's my greatest gift, and I have to have them both at the same damn time. Now, most of us have agreed to hold the good side. Oh, I'm this stalwart Boy Scout that everybody loves and admires and helps little ladies across the street. But in fact, that I'm a righteous zealot who has to be right, and now sits in front of crowds and tells them what the truth is. Oh, God, it's so humiliating. Really, when I first learned this from my Jesuit spiritual director, 1972, Cincinnati, Ohio, I'm driving home to the community and the veil fell. I must have looked like a deer caught in the headlights. Oh my God, I'm a one. I'm an arrogant bastard, I just want to be righteous and hardworking and on time. Oh, sickening, really sickening. But it's the very thing that got me through the seminary. And see, systems reward you for being immature. Stay with that, all right? Systems reward you for your false self, not for your true self. We want you to be good, but not too good. That's why the prophets are all killed. That's why Jesus killed. Because really good people don't buy the game of the world, you see? Francis very line in his own testament, I left the world, I left the system. I couldn't play the game. Maybe that would be another word. I can't believe the lie anymore. That's the first necessary liberation. Then you'll still be freer than ever to see your own naughty flesh stuff. We all have our temperamental idiosyncrasies and blind spots, and God understands that, and God is willing to work with that. But now you're all wondering, or at least you should be wondering, what's the devil? What's the third level? Stay with me. As the nun said, put on your thinking caps, get ready. The world is the system as it structures itself to support itself, to validate itself. There is no country on this earth that does not represent that. There's no institution that does not represent the world. The genius of Jesus was that he saw that. He didn't hate them for it, but he didn't bow down before them either. That's the secret. You don't have to hate institutions, but you better not be on bended knee before them, because they're always about themselves. Let's say it as forthrightly as we can. And we can't do without them either. This is why we live in an imperfect world and why we're all wounded. The only way they can destroy you is if you make an idol out of them. You are on bended knee before your banking system or the military industrial complex. Now, this is the devil. If the world is disguised and denied evil, the devil is going to be those same institutions, but now romanticized and idealized. Stay with me, it's subtle, but it'll make sense to you. It fits, it works. Anything in your way of thinking that is considered too big to fail is highly open to being demonic. Anything that is above criticism. You know where the first devil is in Mark's gospel? In the synagogue. That's no accident. Because the thing up to now that was most unable to be criticized, that was too big to fail, was religion itself. It was above criticism. And any religion that is above criticism, in my opinion, will always love itself, not God. Will always point to itself, not point beyond itself to the absolute. So, can you think of any institutions that, that you can imagine America existing without? And I'm not saying they are demonic. Don't hate me, walk out of the room too quickly, all right? But I'm saying it's very easy for them to be demonic. The banking system, too big to fail. We learned that in 2008. You cannot question it. We must support it at all costs. That is, spiritually speaking, a devil. The penal system. I was a jail chaplain here for 14 years, not far from right here. And this system is not interested in rehabilitating, healing, helping anybody. In fact, so many of the people who want to work there are people who love the power differential between themselves as orderlies or guards and these people who have no power in the jail. Do they see that? Now, none of us are going to think we should tear down the walls of all of our jails and prisons. They're too big to fail. We have to have a penal system. That's what allows these things to grow out of all proportion. Criticism is not allowed. Do we need to say the healthcare system? It's a behemoth that can charge anything. The things that cost $500 here cost $5 in Cuba. I mean, what happened? Can there really be that big a difference? I'm sure all of you have read that marvelous speech that Dwight Eisenhower gave after his presidency was over, after he was no longer general. And he coined the phrase that I'm going to use now, so don't hate me for it. A good Republican president said this. He said it will be the military-industrial complex that will control America. There's no limit to the budget for weapons. When I say romanticized and idealized, I want you to think of every city in America that's grown beyond a few thousand. It will have one monument for sure. And it amounts to a monument that glorifies war. Because you have to glorify war. That's highly open to the demonic. The entire military-industrial complex. Just look for anything that's too big to fail. If it's considered too big to fail, you better be careful. It is capable of the highest level of injustice, oppression, and illusion. Now, what Dom Helder said is, you got to nip it in the bud. If you don't recognize the inherent egocentric nature of systems, that's not to hate them, that's not to totally disaffiliate from them, but it is to avoid bending your knee before them. the spiral of violence will just spiral upward. First, you deny any evil, incorporate anything. In fact, you tend to concentrate entirely on the second level. When you keep your eyes focused on the second level, you don't see the first and the third. In general, at this point in history, it wasn't always this way. I think those who we would presently call conservative tend to concentrate on the second level. Individual nastiness, while totally in love with the system, totally on bended knee, will admit no evil in the system. It's only individuals. And as long as we were aligned at that level, we concentrated not just on individual sin, but as both Angel and I said, largely individual body sin, sexual sin. That was when I was in high school. There was only one sin that was always serious, and were any sin against the sixth or the ninth commandment. Huh? Well, where did they get the authority to say that? Those were the only ones that were always. Well, that kept your eyes off of deceit and injustice and oppression and all the others. In fact, I'm happy to tell you, as a good little 8th grade Catholic boy, I joined the Fighting 69th. You're supposed to laugh. The fighting, don't you old Catholic boys remember the Fighting 69th? We all took a pledge never to have a sexual thought. Yes. Just keep the boys concentrated on their individual sexuality. They can oppress the poor. They cannot pay their employees a just wage. They can hate black people. They can oppose gay people. Just don't have a sexual thought. You see? This won't work anymore. If you want to talk about integral theory, this is my integral theory. All right? This is my holistic moral theology. Conservatives concentrate only on the middle range. What I think the critique that emerged among liberals in the 60s helped us to see the sanctified, idealized nature of the demonic institutions, which they all can be, when they're unquestionable. Anything that's unquestionable. The border guards at the Mexican border, right? When they have all the power and the little guy or the family coming across from Mexico has no power, I'm telling you, that's demonic, all right? It's set up for almost certain injustice, because most people do not know how to handle power. You know, the 3 great temptations of Jesus before he begins his public ministry, go right back and read Matthew 3, are all 3 temptations to the misuse of power. If Jesus himself had to face the 3 possible misuses of power, then certainly all of us do. That's what male initiation was all about, to undo the patriarchal instinct of men to idealize power, to romanticize power. So to say it one more time, I didn't say this yet. The radical gospel person is the one who recognizes evil at all 3 levels. The world, the flesh, and the devil. And withdraws your allegiance from all 3 of them. That's what it would mean to be free. That's what it would mean to recognize the shadow, not just at your individual level. And most shadow talks I've ever heard in my whole life, if they're too Jungian or too psychological, it's just all about you doing your individual shadow work, because I know, even what I just said, probably some of you don't like it, because it isn't easy to take when you've never been told this before, when it sounds like, my God, what is he, a communist or a socialist or no, I'm a Christian, all right? And I was given the eyes to see how evil hides and how evil denies itself. And the most effective way that evil can deny itself and hide is when the whole group agrees, as a group, that it's not evil. It works. It works entirely. And that's why the individual enlightened person is almost always persecuted. Almost always. We want you to be good, but we just want you to be good at that flesh level. We don't want you really to be good at the world and the demon level. Because now you're not a part of the cocktail party conversation here in Dallas tonight, you know? We all talk this way, and all of us live in Dallas kind of bubbles. Not to pick on them, but they're just a little easier to pick on. You know that New Mexico loves to pick on Texas. We project our shadow side. And we've got a shadow side. We sort of, you come to New Mexico and we like these humble little adobe houses and our gates are falling off and our shutters and we have junk in the backyard. And so we project this corporate, slick, smooth America onto Dallas, That's like, we're not that way. No, we're not that way. Of course, we want to be that way. See, that's the whole thing of the shadow. It reveals what you really want, but you can't get, so you hate it in someone else. So I hope you hear my little prejudicial statements in that way, always to make a point. So let me pull this together, if I can pull it together, in this way. Only the whole can carry the parts. Now, if God is another word, it doesn't have to be your other word, but it works. If God is another word for the whole, then precisely God is the one who can forgive everything, who can hold all the parts together. One reason I was so happy to try to explicate the doctrine of the Trinity is if God is 1, 3, 3, 1, what we see is in God, this huge problem of unity and diversity has been resolved from the very beginning. For you and I, we confuse unity with uniformity, and that means to exclude all diversity, to exclude all imperfection, to exclude everybody who isn't like us. So whoever gets the power gets to name the game. But divine unity, if the Trinity is true, is completely different. The Father is not the Son is not the Spirit is not the Father. They protect and defend their difference. So divine unity is precisely diversity protected. Got it? Diversity embraced, diversity honored. What you see in both the world and the devil is no room for diversity. You got to do it in the group way or you're out of the group. We can't create a civilization with this false understanding of unity, which is really human uniformity. That makes the ego comfortable. You and I like uniformity. But to recognize that God honors, protects, and defends and promotes the individual, and that is precisely the unity. Now deal with that for about 5 years, and until it makes sense to you, until it fits inside of your worldview. So God has no trouble with fault, with mistake, with imperfection. That's almost God's job description, to deal with that. So wholeness can hold together the parts. God can hold together everything. What we said early on might just be true. Everything really does belong. And those who are created in that image, like you are, you can allow everything to belong to. It's not a giving up of your principles or your moral ideals. In fact, it's finding them at the deepest level. Stay with that for 5 years till it makes sense. But that will be the work of your contemplation. Live with these seeming paradoxes. Live with these seeming contradictions till one day the great aha will come. And it comes just like a wave of peace or a wave of freedom or a wave of what I liked what you said, Angel, big K knowing, not little k knowing. It's a different level of perception that you can't rationally explain it, but your heart says, it's okay. It's okay. And people who have concentrated all their evil at the second level will think you're compromised, you're a heretic, you're a sinner, just like they thought of the tax collector. And I'm afraid that's just the burden you have to carry. It's never been any different. If you want to be loved by everybody, you better not seek to be enlightened, because people do not really like enlightened people. They're threatened very much by them. One final thing that I have to throw in, for me, the best single giveaway of someone who has dealt with their shadow and done their shadow work is they have a sense of humor about themselves. They can let other people mock them and make fun of them, and they're not offended by it. So if you don't have a sense of humor, right, or if you can't ever let people make fun of you, you're probably repressing a lot of shadow. There's a certain high-level politician in our country right now. Now, why do you think you know who I'm talking about? But I think he is incapable of laughing at himself. Incapable. Absolutely incapable. Whenever you see that, usually on lower levels than that, of someone who cannot laugh at themselves, you know they're in the grip of their shadow. I don't want you to be there. I want you to keep your lighthearted sense of humor about reality, but yourself as a part of that reality. Thank you. Thank you.